From the American Experience Storybook, Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919. This country will not be a permanently good place for any of us to live in, unless we make it a reasonably good place for all of us to live in. The frail, asthmatic boy of Theodore Roosevelt grew up to do so many fascinating things that it is difficult to choose which to include. As a homeschooled child, he loved reading, animals, and eventually weightlifting. As a young adult, he went to law school before dropping out to join the New York State Assembly and hold several other community positions. As a middle-aged man, he was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy to President McKinley, led the Rough Rider Cavalry in the Spanish-American War, was elected governor of New York, became vice president to McKinley, and then the youngest president to take office after McKinley's assassination. As president, Theodore won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to end the Russo-Japanese War, crusaded against monopolies with the Sherman Antitrust Act, and said that America should speak softly and carry a big stick with regard to international affairs. He meant that we should be friendly and mild, but fully prepared to enforce justice and truth, with military if necessary. Theodore believed that the United States had the responsibility to intervene if something immoral was going on in the world. Theodore took several revolutionary stances throughout his political career, including supporting women's rights to vote and inviting the first African-American guest to the White House, Booker T. Washington. Theodore also officially named the White House by having the name printed on his official stationery. Though he certainly made a name for himself politically, for some good reasons, some bad, Theodore is perhaps most remembered for his 1906 National Monuments Act, which protected famous sites such as the Grand Canyon. Thanks to nature-loving Theodore, we have 230 million acres of national parks, reserves, and monuments that we enjoy still today. The following excerpt is from The Boy's Life of Theodore Roosevelt by Herman Hagedorn, Chapter 2. The war ended, the Civil War, a gigantic struggle which had almost shattered the splendid dreams of the founders of the Republic, had broken out, raged for 4 years, and subsided. To Theodore Roosevelt the Younger, it was just a rumbling in the distance, now and then a source of self-questioning why his father should look this way or his mother act that way. The rumblings ceased, the questions were forgotten. There came possibly an exciting echo of both when Uncle Jimmy, whose real name was James Dunwoody Bullock, and who had been a captain in the Confederate Navy, came on a stealthy visit with his brother Irvine to see the sister who had married Theodore Roosevelt. They came under assumed names, for they were noteworthy people and had been accepted from the general amnesty extended to those who had taken up arms against the Union. Uncle Jimmy had, in an English port, built the famous Confederate sea raider Alabama, long the terror of northern shipping. Uncle Irvine had, as a midshipman, fired the last gun discharged from her batteries in the fight with the Kearsarge. As far as young Theodore was concerned, they were like shadows that came and were gone. He was living his own life in his own small world. That world consisted practically of nothing but the house on East 12th Street and the house next door and the 2 yards made into one. But as far as it went, it was interesting and full of things to thrill an inquisitive boy. His father's brother, Robert, lived on number 26. Both houses had wide porches in the rear, overlooking their own yards and gardens of the Gothlet mansion on the 19th Street, and were the playground in which the children were deposited daily in piazza clothes to romp to their heart's content. Uncle Robert's house was quite extraordinarily interesting, for Uncle Robert's wife had a taste for animals of various kinds, domestic and otherwise. She had, for a brief but exciting period, kept a cow in the backyard, brought thither through the basement and the kitchen. But the neighbors did not encourage her attempt at city dairying, and the cow was forced to depart in the way that she had come. There were other, less placid animals on the piazza and the upper floors. There were parrots and pheasants and peacocks and other birds of beautiful plumage, and on the lower piazza was a monkey that terrified the children of number 28. Theodore Roosevelt the elder believed in work, but he believed quite as emphatically in play, and Theodore the younger was an enthusiastic playboy from the start. His elder sister, whom he called Bammy, was now 10 years old, a mature young lady, and from his point of view and from hers, practically grown up. She associated mainly with her parents. Theodore's closest companions were his brother Elliot, known as Ellie, and his younger sister Corinne, known as Connie. There was another who had begun at this date to figure largely in his life. This was a friend of Connie's who lived next to their grandfather's house on Union Square. She was 3 years old, a daughter, 6 weeks older than Connie, of a friend of Mrs. Roosevelt's, and her name was Edith Kermit Caro. From all accounts, she was a nice little girl, and she liked Theodore, and included him in games of house from which Ellie was excluded. He was a delicate boy, and he had a gentle way with him which Connie and Edith, who were rather little, gratefully appreciated. Theodore was the undisputed king of the nursery. Even Ellie and Connie, as they grew, developed into the most rambunctious of wild Indians, and he himself remained delicate and, to all intents and purposes, a chronic invalid. Almost from boyhood, he had suffered from asthma. For years, he could sleep only in sitting posture. But he was a patient youngster who bore pain and the thoughtless lack of consideration of the other children with usual self-control and forbearance. He dominated his suffering from the beginning, reading and playing and telling stories in spite of it. His stories were magical and enthralled Ellie and Connie and Edith and the various cousins who gathered in the nursery to listen. They were all about the wonderful adventures of people who lived in trees and deep forests and were always continued in our next, sometimes for months on end, never reaching a conclusion. It was a small world in which he lived, quiet, proper world with few rough corners. Most of the boys spent their first half-dozen years or so in narrow worlds such as his, but at 6, they go to school and immediately the world for them expands, taking in countless new individuals, each with his own particular circle. Except for a few months at Professor McMullen's Academy on 12th Street, within a stone's throw of the house where he had lived, Theodore did not go to school. Because of the frailness of his body, he was given no opportunity to experience the sharp contact with boys of all ages which school offers. His mind, moreover, was not fed with the varied interests that occupy large groups of boys, working and playing together. It turned hungrily, therefore, to the world of imagination and the world of books. Theodore's imaginative mind, which made him so wonderful a storyteller and so satisfactory a playmate to Connie and Edith in their games of make-believe, was a source of vivid delight, but also occasionally of acute terror. There was the adventure with the man-eating monster called the Zeal, for instance. It happened one day that he was playing tag in Madison Square, just 3 blocks north of 20th Street, a pleasant park for children in those days, a mile or more away from the business section of the city and as quiet as a side street in Brooklyn. A Presbyterian church stood on the east side of the square, and he drifted toward it, drawn irresistibly by the spirit of adventure. It was Saturday. The sexton was airing the building, and the front portal was open. Theodore peered curiously but cautiously in. "Step inside," said the sexton hospitably. "No, thank you," answered Theodore. "Why not?" The boy hesitated. "I know what you've got in there," he said at last. The sexton was amused. "I haven't got anything that little boys shouldn't see," he said encouragingly. "Come on in and look around." Theodore cast a glance around the pews and galleries. The spirit of adventure was struggling within him with timidity, but timidity won. "No, I'd rather not," he said, and he ran over to the park again. But adventure called. The open church fascinated him, and he returned to it again and again, but he did not enter. He told his mother about the hospitable sexton. "Why didn't you go in?" she asked. He was shy about explaining. Possibly he was shy about exposing his timidity. But after a little urge, he reluctantly admitted that he had been afraid lest the zeal should jump out at him from some pew or some hiding place in the shadowy church. "The zeal?" his mother asked. "What on earth do you mean by the zeal?" "Why," explained Theodore, "I suppose it is some big animal like a dragon or an alligator. I went there to church last Sunday with Uncle Robert, and I heard the minister read from the Bible about the zeal, and it made me afraid." Mrs. Roosevelt turned to the concordance, and one after another read the text that contained the word zeal. Suddenly, Theodore's eyes grew big as he exclaimed excitedly, "That's it! The last one you read!" It was from the Psalms. "For the zeal of thy house hath eaten me up." Theodore, those days, was not taking any chances. Life on the whole was not an undiluted joy for the youngster in East 20th Street. Time and again, his asthma kept him awake half the nights, coughing and trying to breathe. In those sessions of pain, his father was his most devoted companion, and night after night would walk up and down the room with the boy in his arms, or in summer take him driving for miles through the countryside in the dead of night. It was possibly in those nocturnal vigils that the boy's affection for his father deepened into a devotion which the passage of time only strengthened. Theodore Roosevelt the elder was a man, if ever there was one, to stir a boy of 7 or 8 to devoted admiration. He was now 35, tall, stalwart, bearded, with the gentleness of a woman and the courage, energy, and simple-heartedness of a backwoodsman. A man of universal feeling who touched every side of life. Aunt Anna Bullock used to say that when he walked with his children, he reminded her of Greatheart in Bunyan. He was, with all his bigness, very human. He passionately loved a good time, and he could dance until he was dead. A boy could cuddle up to him, moreover, and pick his pockets when he came home from business in the evening, confident that he would find something put there to be discovered, though it were such a strange matter as a sick kitten found whimpering somewhere on the way home. Theodore the younger was a born hero worshipper. Delicate boys often are, especially if they have imagination. It was therefore of the greatest moment to the growth of his character that he should have lived those early years so intimately close to a man of such unquestionably heroic stature. His father was his first and remained his greatest hero, but he began to read early, and from his reading to enlist a company of valiant characters who became the inspiration of his daydreams and the leaders of his imaginary adventures. Dr. Livingston's Travels and Researches was probably the first grown-up book that he read, and he must have been very small when he read it, for it is recorded that he was in kilts and could hardly drag the heavy volume from place to place. The adventures of this intrepid Englishman, explorer, naturalist, and apostle of Christ, woke his imagination. Vague and unformed aspirations to be an explorer and a naturalist himself, and to carry the light in dark, barbaric places stirred him. He turned to May Read for further instruction on natural history and for adventures even more thrilling than Livingston's. His father, seeing the trend of his interests, placed before him sound and scientific books. Meanwhile, simultaneously with Connie and Edith, he discovered Our Young Folks' best of children's magazines and devoured Castaway in the Cold, Grandfather's Struggle for a Homestead, and other thrilling boy and girl stories which taught no lessons in natural history, but unobtrusively emphasized a certain ideal of manly conduct in which his father was, in his friendly way, constantly calling his attention. Cooper, too, became a source of more than excited interest. With Natty Bumppo began his acquaintance with the American pioneer, the hard and narrow but intrepid, indomitable, self-reliant, fighting frontiersman, the man who clears the forest and, having cleared it, pushes westward into deeper forest, saying little and imagining that he is only carving out his own daily existence, even while he is carving out a nation. Boone and David Crockett joined King Olaf and Morgan's riflemen in the heroic company which inhabited his imaginations. Theodore the Younger was during those early years primarily an indoor boy, bright as a new dollar, persistent as a mosquito on a summer night when he wanted information, but sickly and nervous much of the time, with good intentions, a will of his own, and plenty of dreams, but no more conception than any other boy of his age of the relation of dreams to accomplishment. He loved to think about great men. Vaguely, he wanted someday to be like them. He wanted certainly to be like his father. Meanwhile, he was a nice little boy who liked books and animals and enjoyed playing with Connie and Edith. So much in general we know of Theodore Roosevelt, age 9. At this point now, the boy himself comes out of the past to tell us about himself. He comes in the shape of a diary written in a cheap notebook. He kept it in Barrytown up the Hudson the summer before he was 10 years old. For 12 days he kept it steadily. Then a break of 3 days, then another break of 9, then 2 more attempts, then silence. He was old enough to feel the need of keeping a diary, but he did not yet have the strength of will to persist in it. He was very much like other boys of 9 going on 10. In that diary, written rather badly for his own interest and intended for no prying eyes, we see Theodore Roosevelt as he truly was that summer before he was 10. And what he was just a boy, wholesome, active, loving the things boys love. Meadows and brooks and ponies and birds' nests and fishes and candy. He had a sorrel Shetland pony named General Grant, after whom Connie vaguely suspected the president had been named. A lovable quadruped with the queer habit of always throwing off his rider once as a preliminary to a pleasant morning ride. With him he rode the highways and byways. I had a ride of 6 miles before breakfast, he writes one day in August. I will always have a ride of 6 miles before breakfast now. There was evidently endless variety to the life, for there is a record of cousins and uncles and friends coming and going. On the day he began his journal, a Monday, he states that the first fig of our garden was eaten that evening, and Uncle Jimmy left us that evening too. 2 departures in a day. A certain Dora came, a certain Annie left. My cousin Jimmy arrived and brought me a crystal and some stones from Niagara Falls. We played fort the rest of the day. Altogether, it was an exciting life. But it was not altogether a play season. There is a significant entry under the date of August 15th. All the morning I played store and baby. In the afternoon, I wrote, read, and drew. That afternoon, I received a continuance of Washington's life. The boy, who was playing kid games in the morning, it seems, was beginning to put in some solid reading for 2- and 3-volume biographies in the afternoons. It was this same summer that Theodore Roosevelt began to take his nature studies with great seriousness. The immediate stimulus had been the discovery of a dead seal lying on exhibition in the market on Broadway, to which he was occasionally sent for breakfast to buy strawberries. The seal, which he was told had been caught in the harbor, thrilled his soul with memories of romantic tales of Mayne Reid and others. Day after day, as long as the seal remained, he haunted the market. With great earnestness, he even measured the seal. The fact that he did not have a tape measure to determine its girth did not deter him. He used a folding pocket rule instead, making a careful record of the measurements. He had for a time a wild ambition of owning and preserving the seal. That ambition was frustrated. He did, however, procure the skull, and on the strength of it, promptly started the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History with 2 of his cousins. Scientific investigation took on a keener interest with the museum as a background, and Theodore determined to write a book. He wrote it in a notebook, which was an exact twin of the one in which he conducted his diary. One suspects that he bought both at the same time, 2 for $5. The title of the book is on the first page. Natural History on Insects by Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. Under it comes the preface. All these insects are native of North America. Most of the insects are not in other books. I will write about ants first. He did, and what he has to say about them is decidedly entertaining. Ants are divided into 3 sorts for every species. These kinds are officer, soldier, and work. There are about 1 officer to 10 soldiers and 1 soldier to 2 workers. He tells about the common black ants and brown path ants and various other kinds of ants. He tells about spiders and ladybugs and fireflies and horned beetles and dragonflies and mosquito hawks. All the insects that I write about in this book, he adds, inhabit North America. Now and then a friend has told me something about them, but mostly I have gained their habits from observation. The reader is left in suspense concerning the particularly vicious habits he may have gained from them by observation. The author of Natural History on Insects adds to his volume a note or 2 on fishes. There is something finely simple about his description of a crayfish. I need not describe the form of the crayfish to you, he writes. Look at a lobster and you have its form. The minnow is dismissed with 1 or 2 generalities. The minnow is found in brooks on the same parts as the crayfish and eel. It eats worms, caterpillars, eggs, bread, and anything, in fact. It swims quite swiftly. It is about 7 inches long when full grown. There are several illustrations by the author in the book, and at the close, this personal note. P.S. My home is in North America. All these stories were gained by observation. Age, 9 years. Born 28th of October. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope you come back for our next one. Love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.